All right, we're going to open session 2 with a word of prayer. God, thank you that we get to spend a little more time talking about worship, that we get to learn from your word, that we would hear your voice speak as we read in 1 Kings and we read in John chapter 4. God, thank you for this time. Continue to reveal yourself to us. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I want to start off this session by looking at the story that Elijah's probably the most famous for. He does a couple of things, and as I was studying, one of the things that I found really shocking is how little Elijah is actually in the Bible. Mm-hmm. He's mentioned a couple times, but he's only there for a few specific stories. And so let me give you kind of the background of the story, and then we can move into how this applies to us. Okay, so the northern kingdom of Israel. So Israel was one kingdom. Then the 2 tribes stay as the southern kingdom. They stick with the line of David, and they have kings from the line of David on until they're cut off and they're exiled. The northern kingdom appoints new kings, and so they're the 10 tribes in the north. When you're reading the scriptures, what you'll find is basically the northern kingdom doesn't have anybody that does anything good. They're all bad. So the northern kingdom of Israel is led by King Ahab. And this is really interesting. In particular, his wife, Queen Jezebel, introduces Baal and Asherah worship into the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay? So Baal is a storm and fertility god, and Asherah is associated with that same kind of thing. Now, the first thing that Elijah does when he's mentioned at the beginning of 1 Kings 17 is this. He goes to Ahab and he says, hey, there's going to be no rain for multiple years. You might have put 2 and 2 together, that if Baal is a storm god, rain is part of the package.
Yeah.
And Elijah goes to him and goes, there's going to be no rain for multiple years. I don't know about you, but those are fighting words.
And your God's going to be inactive.
Yeah, your God is going to be worthless, and I'm telling you this. Well, then Elijah goes and hides out in another town, and then he moves to another place, and he has all this stuff going on, and it sets up this natural showdown that happens. So Elijah's declared that Yahweh is the true God, and Baal is not, and the God of rain, Baal, isn't going to have any control over the thing that he's supposed to have control over. It's this proving point. So Elijah sends a message to King Ahab, and King Ahab then summons all the people to Mount Carmel. So all the prophets of Baal and Asherah come, and in the story we find out that Elijah is the lone prophet of Yahweh that's left. There's all these prophets of Baal and Asherah that come, and they're going to have this showdown. And Elijah looks at all the people, and he says, decide today what you're going to do. Serve Yahweh or serve Baal. Make up your mind. Do one or the other. And here's what happens. All the people stand silent and don't move. They're like, I don't even know what to do at this point. I'm just standing here. Notice, this is after 3 years of no rain. After 3 years of no rain, this is when this showdown happens. 3 years later, okay? So then he turns to the prophets of Baal and gives this challenge. This is what it says. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you go first, for there are many of you. Okay, so fun fact, a little tip when you're reading the Bible. Read it like they're real humans. Like they're actual humans saying these things. The whole point of what Elijah does in a lot of this stuff is he's taunting. He is taunting the prophets of Baal. He is trash talking. That's what's happening. He says, you go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God. But do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until afternoon, shouting, O Baal, answer us. But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced. I love how this translation says this, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed. For surely he is a God. Not he is God. Surely he's a God. Like he's at least one of them. He's one of that kind. Perhaps he's daydreaming. Or is relieving himself. Or maybe he's away on a trip. Or is asleep and needs to be wakened. If you are talking about an actual God, and he has to be woken up, what kind of God is that God? So they shouted louder, and following their normal customs, they cut themselves with knives and swords until blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice. But still, there was no sound, no reply, no response. So what are some of the aspects of Baal worship? What did they do?
They cut themselves. They let themselves bleed before the altar just to get attention.
Yeah, so it's damaging.
Okay, so it's damaging. Okay. What else is present?
There was dancing.
Dancing.
Lots of hobbling.
Hobbling, yeah. Okay, what did you notice? What's something that stuck out to you on the Baal worship?
I just thought it was interesting that he mocked them. I just think it's interesting that he would do that.
That like he would taunt them in that way. Yeah. He's the prophet of Yahweh and he's taunting them, right? Okay. So there was shouting. That was one.
I was going to mention that the need for very loud, audible.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They need volume.
Pay attention.
Yes.
He's been gone for 3 years,
Yeah. So it's like baked in.
Yeah.
He's on a trip. Well, that would explain why there's been no rain for 3 years.
I'm starting to think this is a very long nap.
Yeah, right? Like this is a whole thing that's been caught in there. And I think it's so interesting as we look through it and then we gotta like maybe start going, okay, where is my worship like that? Okay, so now let's look at Yahweh worship. This is what it says. Then Elijah called to the people, come over here. They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of Yahweh that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of Yahweh. Then he dug a trench around the altar long enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bowl into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, fill 4 large jars with water, and pour the water over the offering and the wood. After they had done this, he said, do the same thing again. And when they were finished, he said, do it a 3rd time. So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Yahweh, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself. All right, so what does Yahweh worship look like?
It's a lot of faith.
Okay.
A lot of faith in that he's put a lot of water around, that it's going to show them that Yahweh is there.
He's confident he's being heard. Okay.
Expressing that he's a servant.
Okay. Like he has the proper place. It's not like I'm not equal with Yahweh. I'm a servant of Yahweh.
Right.
Okay.
Noted that he didn't beat around the bush at all. He just got straight to it. He wasn't flashy. He just had them pour the water, and then he started praying, and then he finished. He didn't keep going for hours on end just because he could, or
Right.
He didn't have to warm up.
right.
Yeah. Doesn't take 2 songs.
He didn't need to hobble around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the things that I thought. It's stated. He states it. Elijah is confident he's being heard, like you said, Coy. And he doesn't dance or cut himself to get Yahweh's attention. Part of the process is not getting Yahweh's attention. Okay? So now let's see what happens. Immediately, the fire of the Lord, of Yahweh, flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell down on the ground, made that same posture, right? And cried out, Yahweh, he is God. Yes, Yahweh is God. So not only is Yahweh shown to be superior to Baal, Baal is shown to be completely false, right? Like he doesn't answer. His rain hasn't come for 3 years and he doesn't answer. He doesn't do anything. And this is what the outcome of the whole showdown is, that Baal can't do anything. And in the last section of this chapter, if you go and read it later, rain returns to the land immediately following Yahweh's victory. Elijah says, go out there, look to see if you see a storm cloud. And he's like, I hear the sound of coming rain. And then rain falls and it returns to the land. And so it's not the fertility god Baal that does anything. It's Yahweh, the God of everything, the God of creation, that does it. He can withhold the rain. He can send fire from heaven. He can do it all. So when we read this story, I want you to take note of the difference between Baal worship and Yahweh worship. The worship of Baal requires so much effort. It requires so much effort, right? Like, is that something you notice? Like, well, how would you feel if you were in the Baal worship system?
It is stressful. I was noticing that difference of like when they found out that Yahweh is God, their response was so peaceful. And they were just like, wow, Yahweh is God. And they just bowed. And it was simple.
It's simple. It's 2 phrases, okay?
I'd just be tired if I was worshiping. I just want to sit down.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, in converse, how do you feel about this image of Yahweh worship that you've experienced?
Yahweh worship doesn't take me cutting myself to get his attention.
So it doesn't require getting God's attention.
Right.
He's paying attention. Okay?
I feel like it's 2 different postures. Like they
Okay.
were definitely more in the sense of they were begging and desperate. And while Elijah did want Yahweh to appear, he didn't have to beg. He didn't have to be desperate. He just had to be trusting.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So here, it requires so much effort, right? But ultimately, Baal worship is an exercise in futility. I can work myself up so much and nothing happens. Why is it that like when we worship other things in our lives, it ultimately comes to nothing, because we're ultimately worshiping the grades we want to get, or the school we want to get into, or the girlfriend or the boyfriend, or we're worshiping the admonition of the people around us. We're looking for affirmation from people, and that all is so exhausting. It's so futile. It doesn't bear fruit. Eugene Peterson, in his book, The Jesus Way, it says this: the terrifying majesty of God, his otherness, is watered down into the religious passions of the worshipers. Desires that inflame the soul are fanned by dancing and yelling and bloodletting priests. The transcendence of deity is reduced to the ecstasy of manipulated emotions. Is that not convicting? That we can make it all about emotion when really we should be in awe of our Creator. Yahweh, we don't have to work ourselves up to summon Yahweh. Yahweh is the ever-present one, who is always paying attention, who is always present, who is always near, who is always the host of the party. He's ready. He's attentive. Okay, so now Yahweh worship is simple by contrast. Elijah rebuilds the altar. He douses it in water multiple times, which is like a bold decision in the midst of a 3-year drought, that you're dousing it with water 3 times. That much sustenance is now being depleted in this act of worship, okay? And then he simply asks, and here's the thing that I think is so crazy. It's 4 sentences. His prayer to Yahweh is 4 sentences. And his request isn't even that many. Part of it is hey, so that those people can know what's going on, so that those people can know what I'm saying. He simply asks Yahweh to show the people who he is. And here's the thing. I want to submit to you guys and to everybody who's going to take this class later. The act of Yahweh worship is simply the act of paying attention. Worshiping Yahweh is the act of paying attention. Pay attention to what Yahweh is saying and doing. You don't have to get Yahweh's attention. We've already talked about that, right? You don't have to get Yahweh's attention. He's attentive by his very nature. He acts, he moves, he sends fire from heaven. Through the scriptures, he's always speaking. As one of my friends loves to say, our God never shuts up. He's always talking. He's always talking. He's always talking. So are we going to have ears to listen, eyes to see? Are we going to simply say, God, I'm going to pay attention to what you're doing, what you're saying? And we discover what that is. So don't mix up Yahweh worship and Baal worship. You don't need to get Yahweh's attention. We need to learn to listen and obey. Just think of what Samuel says to Saul as he's being rejected as king of Israel. So Saul is the first king of Israel. He's rejected by God for his disobedience. And then David's line is going to be established, and that's going to go until the exile. So in 1 Samuel 15, it says this: but Samuel replied, what is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than the offering the fat of rams. What is he saying there?
I think it's just, I just need you. I don't need all the fuss and extra. I need you paying attention, and that's
This. I mean, it's the exact line he says. What is more pleasing, sacrifices or your obedience to his voice? So if we pay attention to his voice and we do what he says, that's all that Yahweh's looking for. He's not looking for the sacrifices. He's not looking for the burnt offerings. He's looking for obedience. And that says it all. Like those verses say it all. Obedience is better than sacrifice. So listen to the voice of Yahweh and do what he says. And here's another Eugene Peterson quote that you can hear it in his words. In Yahwehism, worship is defined and shaped by God's authoritative and clear word. Nothing is dependent on feelings or weather, as in the Baal story. All is determined by Scripture and Jesus. No person is left to do what he or she simply feels like doing. God has revealed who he is and demands obedience. Worship is the act of attending to that revelation and being obedient to it. You hear, we're all saying it in different words, but it's the same thing. It's that same thing that Samuel says, listen to the voice of God and do that. If that's what our worship is, then I think we're on to something. I think we're on to what Yahweh actually wants, is for us to pay attention and simply do what he says. All right, now we're going to go to John chapter 4. There's an interesting exchange between Jesus and this Samaritan woman at the well. So in this story, it's really famous that like Jesus reveals that he's the Messiah to this woman, and it's like shocking. But there's like this fun little exchange about worship in the middle of it that sometimes like we miss out on. And here's what happens. She's talking with him about all this stuff. He's saying all these things, and then she goes, where are we supposed to worship? Here at Mount Gerizim, like we think, because she's a Samaritan, or in Jerusalem, like you guys say. And Jesus does one of the things he does oh so well. He answers a different question, right? Jesus does this to us sometimes. We're like, what am I supposed to do with my life? And Jesus is like, hey, go love your neighbor. And you're like, that wasn't what I meant. But he's like, it's what I meant. Yeah. You know? And so here's what it says in verse 23. But the time is coming. Indeed, it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit. So those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. She asks, where do we worship Yahweh? And he replies, Yahweh can't be tied down to a place. Our God's on the move. Our God is alive. He like, when it says worship him in spirit and in truth, like, worship him with all that you are. Be sincere about it. Worship this specific one, this Yahweh. Listen and submit your whole life to Yahweh. So here's my question to you guys. What does this look like on Monday or Thursday or Saturday if you don't have church on Saturday, because some of you might. But like, what does it look like on Monday or Thursday? Like, what does it look like? What does worship look like on those days?
I feel like I forget about it.
Okay.
I don't never do it every day. Forget about it.
Okay. But what I would guess is that you do it at some level. Like anytime you listen and obey what the Spirit of God is speaking to you, you're worshiping. So when you're kind to your neighbor, you're worshiping. So when you're kind to your coworker, you're kind to your fellow student, you're worshiping. When you love those around you, you're worshiping. Does it change kind of the context of like, we've really got to broaden our perspective, right?
I feel like when you start seeing it that way, it makes it so much easier.
Yeah. Because I don't have to cram it into the 20 minutes we sing at worship, during worship at church, right? I don't have to cram all my worship into this one moment. And I've been so guilty of this as a human being. Like I've played guitar for worship and I've like led songs for worship for a long time. And I know I've done this where I've been like, if I don't get the feeling of like God's presence, which I'm pretty sure I'm inadequately naming, right? Like if I don't get the butterflies in my stomach, then like it wasn't a good night of worship. But oh, how I've missed it. I've turned Yahweh worship into Baal worship. When in reality, if I simply am paying attention to what God's wanting to do in the room, if I'm paying attention to what God's wanting to do in my world, then I'm worshiping rightly, in a beautiful way, in a good way. And so I want to encourage you with that of don't feel the pressure to cram all your worship into 20 minutes on a Sunday or on a Wednesday. You've got your whole life to fill with worship. It's way less stressful, but it might be more demanding. It's more demanding on us, but it's more beautiful and more wonderful.